While the new market for sub-£200 GPUs is populated by underwhelming Radeons and hopefully priced 1050 Ti's, the used market is getting spicy. With prices dropping for the first time in a year, there are now some truly exciting options available from a generation of graphics cards that still have driver support and full compatibility with modern APIs. Sadly, I'm not talking about Vega. 56s and 64s are still priced like someone expects a resurgence of Ethereum any day now, but higher tier Pascal cards like this GTX 1070 are making a strong case for why they should be your next gaming GPU. This Asus Strix is one of the fancier GTX 1070 versions out there, with enough cooling to ensure the GPU boosts way higher than its spec suggests. Even though the shroud doesn't float my personal aesthetic boat like a good Sapphire or Ampere Founders Edition, I'll still admit it's a handsome card. What's still impressive to me after 6 years is that the reference 1070 has on-paper performance close to an RTX 3050, but a TDP only 20 watts higher. If the rest of your system is relatively efficient, you can run a 1070 off a good 400 watt PSU, and you certainly don't need much more than 500 watts. Unlike the 3050, the GTX card has no tensor cores for deep learning supersampling and no RT cores for hardware ray tracing. What it does have is 8GB of GDDR5, which should be more than enough to run my benchmark suite with some high quality texture settings. As usual, that benchmark suite consists of a gauntlet of 12 modern games running on my test rig, the moderately priced gaming PC. Its 6-core Ryzen 5 5600G, overclocked to 4.6GHz and paired with 16GB of DDR4 3600, is a good deal more powerful than the majority of systems were in mid-2016, but represents the average low-end enthusiast build in 2022. To cater to gamers still running their old Skylake machines or who have built something a little cheaper in more recent times, I've also run all my tests a second time with 2 cores disabled and reduced clock speeds. Now, how's this for a start to the benchmarks? The GTX 1070 handily beats its predecessor, the 980 Ti, in God of War. At 1080 original with ultra textures, normal gameplay sees average FPS over 70 and lows approaching 60. During the much more intensive cinematic cutscenes, that only ever drops into the mid-50s. In fact, there's enough leeway here to turn quality up to high and still see an average above 60, though of course this will see more drops below 60, and in return only see the slightest increase in visual quality. Performance in the Final Fantasy VII Remake is pretty much identical to the Maxwell flagship card from the year before, only using 100 watts less power to get there. 1080 with settings maxed out can be rendered at about 90 FPS, with lows dipping just below 60. 1440 drops to a 70 FPS average, though as the game has non-optional dynamic resolution scaling, the image might get a little softer as the game gets more demanding. If you've seen my previous videos on the GTX 900 series cards, you'll know they have a performance bug in Guardians of the Galaxy that only gets resolved by rolling back to older drivers. The 1070 proves that this particular issue is peculiar to Maxwell, as this Pascal card performs brilliantly without messing around with drivers. 1080 High averages 78 FPS, and turning quality up to Ultra only sees that fall to 76. Though, as I always have to point out, my personal experience of the early stages of the game show that it can be much more demanding than the benchmark lets on. Forza Horizon 5 is another revelation on the GTX 1070. 1080 High is smooth as butter, coming close to 90 FPS on average and with 1% lows well above 60 FPS. If you're happy to put up with a slight dip in minimums, you might consider turning settings up to Ultra. This can still provide a 60 FPS average, though in more demanding areas you'll see frame rates drop into the low 50s. I should be more impressed with this, but recent experience has soured the moment for me. The GTX 1070 can do a pretty good job in Halo Infinite, with single-player outdoor sequences hitting 68 FPS on average at 1080 low, and 55 FPS at 1080 medium. I also took a moment to try high settings, though only on the quad-core setup. This scored 47 FPS on average and didn't drop below 30. In big team battles, I would guess players would prefer FPS to bells and whistles, so I benchmarked at 1080 low and saw an average of 77 FPS. Why wasn't I impressed? Well, last week I reviewed the otherwise lesser performing RX 6500 XT, only to find it's pulled a rabbit out of its hat in this particular title. Once you finish with this video, that one's worth a watch. Link below. As a Cyberpunk fan, I don't like running below medium settings, as the lighting and level of detail drops sharply, so I'm happy to say the 1070 can deliver the goods. At 1080 medium settings sees an average of bang on 60 FPS, with 1% lows of 47 on the 6-core and 40 on the quad-core. If you're happy with a 30 plus experience, you might even see a benefit from jumping up to 1080 high. At those settings, the card can still produce a 48 FPS average, and that's good enough for Peter Jackson. Rainbow Six Extraction sees a healthy 10% performance uplift from the GTX 980 Ti here. Whereas that card managed to run the benchmark at 101 FPS at 1080 high, the 1070 sees that rise to 111 FPS on average. Like with Guardians of the Galaxy, my previous testing has shown that quality settings below high don't make that much of a difference to performance, but perhaps by leaving resolution scaling on automatic, which is the default, you should be able to reach the refresh rate of a 144Hz monitor without too much sacrifice in visuals. Talking of high refresh gaming, Splitgate is an impressively undemanding title that can really stress the GPU, even with a less modern CPU. At 1080 Epic, the 3-match average scored 255 FPS with lows of 128. On a more CPU-intensive game like Valorant or CSGO, one might expect the RPG PC setup to suffer a little here, but in this case the 1070 only loses about 10 FPS on average. While these numbers are impressive, by the way, the 1070 can't usurp the 980 Ti's top spot in my 2022 Splitgate leaderboard. It does, however, push the Fury X back into third place. Like with Splitgate, I've come to benchmark Call of Duty Vanguard over several matches and average them rather than just using a single game. Nevertheless, this still doesn't guarantee a consistent average. The 6-core MPG PC setup manages a superb 99 FPS average and 1% lows over 60 at 1080 normal with high textures. The 4-core RPG PC setup drops over 10 FPS. This is a bigger margin than I've seen on other GPUs, so I'm guessing the difference is down to the luck of the map rotation draw. Using the competitive settings of Epic, View Distance and everything else to low or off, Fortnite in DX12 is starting to show signs of being limited by the CPU in the quad-core setup. The RPG PC configuration, designed to represent gamers still using older hyper-threaded quad-cores like the i7-6700 or Ryzen 3 3100, manages about 200 FPS here. On the overclocked 6-core config, however, the game manages to run almost 20% faster at over 235 FPS. If you prefer a bit more visual fidelity, the 1070 can still provide an excellent 100 FPS at high settings with view distance set to Epic. This is honestly some of the best performance I've seen in Battlefield 2042 so far. At 1080 medium settings, the GTX 1070 can deliver almost 80 FPS on average, with 1% lows of about 50. Also, for those wondering, my Battlefield testing involves a full game of Conquest on a live 64-player server, and I try to take in all the sectors and get on board some vehicles where possible. As people who know how I felt about Enlisted will be aware, I'm not a big fan of this style of game, so I hope you appreciate the pain I put myself through to benchmark it. Wrapping things up, Warzone at 1080 with a mix of normal and high settings is pretty much a dead heat between the GTX 1070 and 980 Ti. Both cards score averages in the mid-80s and neither card dips below 60, so you should be able to have a great time with either card. That is, assuming you're a better player than I am, which shouldn't be hard. The Scalper pandemic has done a number on our perceptions of value. Not so long ago, £200 couldn't buy a GTX 1060, let alone a 1070. Thankfully, at least for the time being, things seem to be taking a turn for the better, and these cards are available for what I think is an absolute bargain price. I found this card listed on eBay for £200, but the seller accepted an offer of £180. At the time of recording, there are still listings available on eBay UK for £200 or less, and I dare say anyone with the time and patience could find an even better deal. When you consider that the closest models to this price, brand new, are the RX 6500 XT and GTX 1650, this makes the 1070 look like an absolute steal. Unless you have a higher resolution monitor or really want to try out ray tracing, I don't think you need to upgrade from this card at all in 2022. If you're looking to buy one, the running costs and better compatibility, specifically with Guardians of the Galaxy, means this one earns a recommendation over the 980 Ti. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.